My daughter-in-law forgot to hang up the phone. I heard her say 6 words that changed everything. He won't even know the difference. I didn't say a word back. 3 months later, my son and his wife came home from their anniversary trip in Cabo, tan and laughing, right up until the security code on their own front door stopped working. Taped to that door was an envelope with my son's name written on it, and by the time they finished reading what was inside, my daughter-in-law was sitting on the porch steps with her head in her hands. My name is Walter Nash. I'm 68 years old. For 36 years, I ran a hardware store on Route 9 outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the kind of place where I knew customers' names and their fathers' names before them. I raised my son Danny in a two-story colonial on Birchwood Court, watched my wife Carol fight cancer in the back bedroom of that same house, and figured I'd spend whatever years I had left rattling around those rooms with her memory and my tools and my quiet. My son had other ideas about how those years should go. This is the story of what he and his wife tried to take from me, and what an old man who spent his whole life reading people's faces across a hardware counter did about it before they ever saw it coming. Carol passed 18 months ago, on a Sunday in October, with the leaves just starting to turn outside her window. I sat with her hand in mine until the very end, and when the hospice nurse finally said the words I'd been dreading for months, something in me went quiet in a way I don't think it ever fully came back from. The house on Birchwood Court had 31 years of our life packed into it, her garden out back, the kitchen table where we'd raised Danny, the closet that still smelled like her sweaters no matter how many times I opened the window. I wasn't lonely. Exactly. I was something heavier than lonely. I was a man learning to live in the silence where another person used to be. Danny called me most Sundays, sometimes Wednesdays too. And about 4 months after Carol died, he and his wife Kristen drove up from their place in Mechanicsburg with a proposal that sounded, God help me, like the answer to a prayer I hadn't said out loud. Dad, we've been talking, Danny told me, standing in my kitchen in his work boots, still smelling like the construction site he managed. You've got all this space. We're paying too much in rent as it is, saving for a down payment that keeps slipping further away every year prices go up. What if we moved in here for a while? Help you out around the house, keep you company, and put money aside for our own place at the same time. I said yes before he even got to the end of the sentence. I remember thinking, sitting there at that kitchen table, that maybe the house wasn't going to be so quiet after all, and that maybe some good could still come out of the worst year of my life. Within a month, they'd given notice on their apartment and moved into Danny's old room and the guest room down the hall, the one Carol used to keep made up for visitors who rarely came. For a good stretch of time, I'd say 5, 6 months, it really did feel like a gift. Kristen was a decent cook, better than decent some nights, and she'd have dinner on the table when I came in from puttering in the garage. Danny fixed the leak in the roof I'd been putting off for 2 years, cut the grass every Saturday morning without me asking twice. We watched the Steelers together on Sunday afternoons the way we used to when he was 12 years old and thought his old man hung the moon. I told my neighbor Jean, who'd lived across the street from us since before Danny was born, that I was about the luckiest widower in Dauphin County, having my own boy look out for me like that. I had no idea, none at all, that the same young man passing me the mashed potatoes every night had already started doing math on my house, my savings, and how many years I might reasonably have left in me. It was little things at first, the kind of things you talk yourself out of noticing because the alternative is too ugly to sit with. Kristen started saying "our house" to her sister on the phone in the kitchen, like it had just slipped her mind whose name was on the deed. She swapped out the curtains Carol had sewn herself for a set she'd ordered online, told me the old ones were faded and outdated, like 30 years of my wife's handiwork was something to be tidied away. Danny started asking about my finances in a way that felt less like a son checking in and more like a man doing inventory. How much was left in my 401k from the store, whether the mortgage was paid off, whether I'd ever thought about what happens to a house like this down the line. I told myself a son should care about those things. I told myself a lot of things that spring that I don't much like admitting to now. One evening at dinner, Danny mentioned, casual as anything, that his buddy Ray had just sold his late father's house over in Camp Hill for close to $780,000. Cash deal, closed in 3 weeks. Market's insane right now, Dad, he said, looking around my kitchen the way a man looks at a used car he's already decided to buy. Something about the way he said it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, though I couldn't have told you why at the time, not with any words that made sense. A week later, Kristen started inviting a friend of hers over for coffee on Thursday afternoons. A woman named Beth, who I later found out sold real estate for a living, and who, had I learned Much later, already walked through my house top to bottom while I was at the pharmacy, pricing it out like it already belonged to somebody else. Looking back now, I can see the whole shape of it laid out clean and simple, like a blueprint. Back then, all I saw was my son and his wife settling in, and an old man grateful to have supper company again. I want you to sit with that feeling for a second, that trust, that relief, because it's exactly what made the ground drop out from under me a few weeks later, when I finally understood what had been happening under my own roof the whole time. About 7 months into all this, Danny started dropping little comments. Dad, you're getting more forgetful than you used to be, even on days I hadn't forgotten a blessed thing. I misplaced my truck keys one Tuesday morning, same as I'd misplaced them 100 times over 68 years. And by dinner, Danny was telling Kristen across the table, talking about me like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away, that it was starting to worry him. I laughed it off the first time, told him everybody loses their keys. He didn't laugh back. Not long after that, he started insisting on driving me to my appointment with Dr. Amaro, even though I'd been driving myself to that office for 11 years without so much as a fender bender. And he'd sit right there in the exam room, asking pointed questions about memory screenings and early warning signs, questions I never once asked for and didn't need answered. Then the pamphlets started showing up on the kitchen counter. Glossy ones, soft lighting, silver-haired actors smiling over games of bridge, names like Maple Grove Senior Living and Autumn Hills Retirement Community. When I asked Kristen about them, she said, sweet as pie, "Oh, those are just something to have on hand, Walter, in case we ever need to think about it down the road." Down the road. That exact phrase. I didn't say anything back to her. I didn't want to be the paranoid old man accusing his own family over a stack of brochures somebody left lying around. So I kept my mouth shut, kept thanking them for looking after me, while some part of me, the part that spent 36 years behind a register, learning which customers were telling the truth and which ones were working an angle, started listening a lot more carefully to every word coming out of that kitchen. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in May. I'd gone down to the basement to find a torque wrench I hadn't touched since I sold the store, just puttering around the way old men do when the house gets too quiet, when I heard Kristen's voice drifting down through the floor vent from the kitchen above. She was on the phone, talking low and quick, the way people talk when they're sure nobody's listening. "No, I'm serious," she was saying. "Danny already talked to a lawyer friend from work. Once we can show a pattern, the forgetfulness, missed appointments, whatever we can document, it makes everything so much easier. We're not talking about kicking him out of his life. We're talking about him getting the care he needs. He won't even know the difference, honestly, once he's settled in somewhere nice." I stood frozen at the bottom of those basement stairs with a torque wrench in my hand, my heart going so hard I was sure she'd hear it through the vent. She kept talking. "Beth already ran the comps. We're looking at right around $780,000 if we list before the fall market cools off. That covers a nice place for him for years, and there's plenty left over for us to finally get out of that apartment." Somebody must have said something on the other end, because Kristen laughed. Actually laughed, and said, "It's not like we're doing anything wrong. He's had a good run in that house. He won't even know the difference." 6 words. I stood at the bottom of those stairs for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, and I did not make a sound. I set that torque wrench down as quietly as I'd picked it up, walked back up the basement stairs, out through the side door, and sat down on the tailgate of my old truck in the driveway like nothing in my entire world had just come apart at the seams, even though it had. I'll be honest with you about something. My first instinct was to march back into that kitchen and ask my daughter-in-law exactly what kind of woman talks about her husband's father, like he's a piece of furniture headed for the curb. But I didn't. 36 years of running a hardware store teaches you plenty of things, and the most useful one isn't how to fix a leaky faucet. It's how to keep your face steady when somebody's lying to you, so you've got time to figure out exactly what they're up to before you say a single word. So that night at dinner, I ate Kristen's pot roast and asked Danny how the job site was coming along, same as any other Tuesday. I didn't say a word about the phone call. Didn't mention Maple Grove. Didn't mention $780,000. Didn't mention the fact that my own daughter-in-law had just talked about disposing of me the way you talk about clearing out a garage. I went to bed that night and didn't sleep. Not for 1 minute. I lay there in the dark, running back through every one of those brochures. Every appointment Danny had suddenly started tagging along to, every casual question about my savings and my mortgage and what I planned to do down the line. It all lined up now, every single piece, like a puzzle I'd been too grateful and too trusting to see the shape of. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, lying in the bed I used to share with Carol, in the house where I'd raised the same boy who apparently wanted me gone, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to accuse anybody of a single thing. I was simply going to find out exactly where I stood, legally and otherwise, before they got the chance to make their first real move. The following Monday, I told Danny I had a follow-up with Dr. Amaro across town, and I drove myself there in my own truck, the same 2009 Chevy Silverado I'd had since before Carol got sick. Instead of the doctor's office, I drove to see a lawyer named Patricia Colon, whose office sat above a bakery in downtown Harrisburg, recommended to me years back by an old customer who used to buy his fencing supplies from me every spring. I sat across from her desk and laid it all out, the phone call, the brochures, the questions about my finances, every bit of it. Patricia listened without interrupting once, taking notes on a legal pad, and when I finished, she pulled up the county property records right there on her computer screen. "Mr. Nash," she said, "I want to be very clear with you. This house is deeded in your name and your name alone. Nobody can sell it, commit you anywhere, or touch a cent of your money without your signature, unless you've already given someone power of attorney." Then she asked me a question that dropped straight through my stomach. "Has your son asked you to sign anything lately? Anything he described as routine paperwork, insurance updates, anything along those lines?" And there it was, instantly, in my memory, a folder of papers Danny had left on the kitchen counter about 10 days earlier, telling me they were updated homeowners insurance forms the mortgage company needed on file. I hadn't signed them yet. Kept meaning to get around to it, kept putting it off because Carol always told me never to sign anything without my reading glasses and a clear head, and some habits from a good marriage just stick with a man. Patricia told me to bring those papers in the next day, and when I did, she read through them once, twice, and then looked up at me with an expression I won't forget. They weren't insurance forms at all. They were a durable power of attorney, granting Danny full authority over my finances, my healthcare decisions, and my property. I never signed that document, and I never will, but finding it changed something in me for good. I wasn't just a father being talked about behind closed doors anymore. I was a man whose own son had tried to trick him into handing over his entire life with a stack of papers made to look boring enough that nobody would read past the first line. Patricia helped me understand exactly where I stood, and she put me in touch with a realtor she trusted without hesitation, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Okafor who worked out of an office in Camp Hill, known for closing deals fast and quiet when a client needed discretion more than anything else. I met Diane at a diner off Route 15, paid for both our coffees in cash, and told her plainly that I wanted to sell my house without my son or his wife knowing a single thing about it until the deal was already done. Diane didn't ask me why. She just nodded, the way somebody nods when they've heard a version of this story before, and told me a house like mine, 3 bedrooms, updated kitchen Carol had insisted on years back, sitting on half an acre with mature oaks in the yard, could bring close to $780,000 if we moved fast in a market like this one. I opened a new account at a credit union, clear across the county, one Danny had never heard of, had my mail rerouted to a P.O. box, and started meeting Diane every Thursday afternoon while my son and his wife thought I was at physical therapy for my hip. For the first time in months, I felt like the ground was solid under my feet again, and I can't rightly describe to you how good that felt. To keep Danny and Kristen calm and unsuspecting, I did something that still makes me chuckle a little, even now. I let them take me on a tour of Maple Grove. I walked those hallways, smelling like lemon polish and lavender air freshener, nodded along at the bingo schedule pinned to a corkboard, told the tour guide the dining room looked awfully nice, all while knowing full well I had no intention of ever spending a single night there. Danny looked so pleased in the car afterward, telling Kristen on speakerphone that Dad seemed genuinely open to the idea that I nearly felt sorry for him. Nearly. Meanwhile, Diane had quietly listed my house through a private network of serious buyers. The kind of listing that never shows up on the big websites Danny or Kristen might stumble onto by accident. Within 11 days, we had 2 solid offers on the table. The best one came from a young couple, Marcus and Angela Bryce, expecting twin girls who fell in love with the oak tree Carol used to hang a tire swing from when Danny was small. Their offer came in at $780,000, cash, fast closing, no contingencies, exactly the clean deal Patricia had told me to hold out for. I signed that agreement in Diane's office with a hand steadier than I expected, thinking about Kristen's voice through that floor vent, saying he won't even know the difference. Well, I remember thinking, somebody around here is about to find out the difference real quick, and it isn't going to be me. About 2 weeks after I signed, Danny came home from work practically bouncing, same as he used to when he was a boy and made the varsity team. His company was covering an anniversary trip for him and Kristen to Cabo San Lucas. 10 days, all expenses paid, some kind of employee reward program. Kristen was already talking about the resort spa and a dinner reservation on the beach. Perfect timing, Dad. Danny told me over supper, not knowing exactly how right he was. While we're gone, maybe start thinking harder about Maple Grove. Could even put a deposit down before we're back. Get the ball rolling. I told him I'd think about it. Same steady voice I'd been using for weeks by then. And inside my head, I was running the numbers. Diane and Patricia had already worked it out. Closing could happen in as little as 10 days, once both sides signed. And Marcus and Angela, pre-approved and eager, were ready to move the second I gave the word. Danny and Kristen left for the airport on a Friday morning. Suitcases lined up by the door. Kristen reminding me twice to water her ferns while they were away. I stood on the front step and waved as Danny's car backed out of the driveway he used to shoot baskets in as a boy. And the moment that car turned off Birchwood Court and disappeared past Jean's place across the street, I picked up the phone and called Diane. Told her one simple thing. Let's move the closing up. Let's get it done this week while they're gone, before they ever have the chance to fly home and try to stop what's already in motion. The closing happened that Wednesday, 5 days into their trip, in a small conference room at a title company off 2nd Street. Marcus and Angela Bryce sat across from me, Angela's hands resting on her belly, both of them near giddy about raising their girls under that same oak tree. I signed page after page, feeling lighter with every stroke of the pen. When it was done, Diane handed me a check for $780,000, minus fees and commission. More money than I'd ever held in one place in my life. I'd already found my next home by then. A bright, independent living apartment at a community called Riverbend, 40 minutes east along the Susquehanna, with a view of the water from every window and a woodshop in the basement I could use whenever the mood struck me. Nobody handed me a brochure for this one. I found it myself, walked it myself, paid for it myself, and signed my own name on my own lease. I spent that Wednesday and all of Thursday with 2 movers I'd quietly hired weeks in advance, packing up 31 years of a life Carol's china, my father's old level and hand plane, the photographs off the stairwell wall, and left the rest for the new owners, who were more than happy to take the furniture off my hands at a fair price. By Thursday night, the house on Birchwood Court belonged completely to Marcus and Angela Bryce. A locksmith Diane had arranged came by that afternoon and changed every lock and reprogrammed the keypad. And by evening I was sitting in my new living room in Riverbend, watching the light fade over the water with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, feeling more peace settle into my chest than I had in well over a year. Before I left Birchwood Court for the last time, I sat down at the kitchen table where Carol and I had eaten breakfast together for 31 years, and wrote one final letter not to wound anybody, just to tell the truth plain. I taped it beside the front door, right at eye level, in an envelope with Danny's name written across it in the same handwriting I used to sign his report cards. I told him I knew everything. Told him I'd been standing at the bottom of the basement stairs that Wednesday in May with a torque wrench still in my hand when I heard Kristen tell somebody on the phone that I'd had a good run and that I wouldn't even know the difference. I told him the house had been sold, fair and legal, to a young family who'd love it a whole lot more than 2 people who'd spent the better part of a year plotting how to put their own father out to pasture. I told him I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Just disappointed in a way that sits a lot heavier than anger ever could. And that I hoped one day he'd understand exactly what it feels like to be the person somebody else has quietly decided is a problem to solve. I told him not to bother with the old number, since I'd already closed those accounts, but that I'd pick up if he ever called just to say he was sorry and meant every word of it. I signed it the way I'd signed every letter to that boy since he was 7 years old. Love, Dad. Then I locked the door behind me for the very last time, got in my truck, and drove east without once looking in the mirror. Danny told me later, though I didn't hear it straight from him until nearly 2 weeks after, that he and Kristen pulled into that driveway on a Sunday evening, sun-baked and relaxed off the flight from Cabo, Kristen already chattering about her ferns and unpacking. Danny walked up to that front door with his key in hand, same as he'd done 10,000 times before, punched in the keypad code out of habit, and nothing happened. He figured the batteries had died, tried the physical key next, and it wouldn't turn either. That's when Marcus Bryce opened the door from the inside, a baby monitor clipped to his belt, looking about as confused as a man can look, asking Danny who exactly he was and why he was trying to force his way into a house that belonged to him and his wife. According to Gene, who watched the whole thing from his porch across the street the way Gene watches everything, Danny stood frozen on those front steps for a long moment before he spotted the envelope taped beside the doorframe with his name written across the front. Jean said Kristen read it first, standing right there on the lawn in the last of the daylight, and that her hand started shaking somewhere around the middle of the second page. Jean said Danny finally grabbed the letter out of her hands when she couldn't get through it, read the rest himself, and that's when it started the shouting, right there on the front lawn. Loud enough that two other neighbors stepped out onto their porches to see what in the world was going on. Jean told me Kristen ended up sitting on the porch steps with her face in her hands, and that Danny just stood there holding that letter, staring at a house that no longer had a single thing in it belonging to him, in front of a family he'd never laid eyes on a street he'd been so sure would be his in a matter of months. My phone started ringing about 6 minutes later. I didn't answer it that night, didn't answer it the next day either. Danny called me 26 times over the next 4 days, and I let every one of them go straight to voicemail, not to be cruel, but because I wanted him to sit for a while, with exactly the feeling he'd been so ready to hand me without a second thought. On the 5th day, sitting out on my balcony in Riverbend with the river running gold in the evening light, I finally picked up. His voice broke the second I said hello. "Dad, please, it wasn't supposed to go like that. We can fix this. Just tell me where you are." I let him talk himself out for a good while. Let him get through the apologies and the excuses about money being tight and things spiraling faster than he ever meant them to. And when he finally ran out of words, I told him the truth as plain as I could manage. Told him I'd heard every word of that phone call back in May, standing at the bottom of my own basement stairs. Told him I knew about the power of attorney, dressed up as insurance paperwork. Told him I'd known exactly what Maple Grove and $780,000 meant to him and Kristen for months before I ever said a word about any of it out loud. I told him I wasn't going to raise my voice at him because he was still my son and I still loved him. Plain and simple, the way a father does no matter what. But I told him that love didn't mean I owed him a house I'd worked 36 years to pay off, and it sure didn't mean I owed him a thing after he'd decided on his own, without ever once asking me. That I'd had a good run, and it was time to be moved along. I told him I was happy, genuinely, all the way down, happy in a place I'd picked out myself, surrounded by people my own age who talked to me like a man instead of a problem waiting to be managed. Before I hung up, I told him the door wasn't shut forever. Not completely, but that it would only open again once he was ready to see me as his father again, and not as $780,000 standing between him and the life he thought he was owed. I set the phone down on the little table next to my coffee, looked out over that river one more time, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I could rightly remember. Real peace. If you've made it this far with me, you already know exactly what it feels like when a quiet man finally decides he's done being quiet.